Welcome back to the Marvel Movie Minute, a daily podcast in which we explore the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe 1 minute at a time. In this, our fourth season, we're looking at Kenneth Branagh's 2011 film, Thor. I'm Matthew Fox from theethicalpanda.com.
And I'm Andy Nelson from thenextreel.com.
And folks, today we've had our hiatus episodes. We've talked about comics. We've talked about a short. We've talked about all the things we're excited about. But today we are actually jumping right into the movie itself. We're talking about minute 1, which begins with a Paramount logo and it ends with Jane Foster typing away. Andy, what kind of jumps out at you from this minute? What'd you most notice?
Well, one, we're looking at, I think at least half of this is probably just credits. It's kind of interesting now looking back on this and going, oh yeah, this was back when Paramount was involved in all of this. Yep. So that was kind of a funny thing to notice. And then I think the other thing that I noticed is just how focused this story is on Earth and science right out of the gate. And it was kind of, I don't know, it was nice to kind of remember. And I suppose, going all the way back to Iron Man episode 1, we talk about earning your wizards. And I think that certainly makes sense here. Like we're starting grounded on Earth in science before we get into all the magic and craziness. I
think that's another thing that really grabbed me as well. We'll get to it when we hit that part of the minute. But for me, what that says from the very beginning is this is a movie about humans starting to understand about the world of Thor. It's not just going to drop us right into Asgard. And I really appreciate that. I think it's going to really... It sets the framework for a lot of what we're going to discuss. And so we're going to get into that. We're going to talk about a number of different things as part of this minute. But I know one of the things I'm most excited about is that this is going to be a conversation. It's not just you and I talking, Andy. It's all the fans are going to have a chance to kind of join in and share their thoughts. Tell them about the Discord. They get to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to jump into the conversation with us about Thor and the minutes that we are discussing this week, we have a growing group of Marvel fans just waiting to chat with you over in our Discord server. If you just head to truestory.fm/Marvel Movie Minute, you can click on the Discord link and it'll get you set up. We can't wait to chat with you over there.
I'm someone who's kind of new to the network. It's been a lot of fun getting to hear people's thoughts on Iron Man and see that discussion go. And I'm just really excited to see that happen here with Thor. So, like you said, we get through, we see the Paramount logo. I'd forgotten entirely that Paramount was ever involved, which was kind of fun. And the first thing that hit me was, it reminded me that we didn't always have this Marvel logo that was based in the movies. And it's funny, I haven't thought about this in years, but I feel like I missed, because what I'm talking about is that we get the Marvel logo, but it's all the flipping pages noises from the comics. And I feel like I kind of missed this that it's so grounding us and remembering us that this is a story about comic book characters.
Yeah, and I think it's in the name of this particular logo that they had. It's called their Flipbook logo. Imaginary Forces created it back in 2002. It, I think, was one of the Spider-Man releases when this logo was first introduced. And what I've always wondered as I watch this so many times, I wonder if they change images out periodically as it goes through.
Yeah.
Apparently they don't. I guess what they did is they picked like 120 different images that they said, quote, were universal and not specific to one character. And then they just kind of created this flip book. But I love the way that it feels and it flows, and it's got the words on the screen periodically sometimes, and it builds into that Marvel verbiage. And I don't know. I've always loved the logo. I think you're right. There's something really kind of magical about the fact that it grounds it in the comic books that they were doing.
The new one is fun. And of course, they've done some great things like the tribute to Chadwick Boseman they did for at least one of the movies, and a tribute to Stan Lee. But I definitely missed that.
Yeah.
So, those things take up about 30 seconds in a movie. It is funny, like, watching this. I don't think of this as a slow movie, but when I realized, like, nothing happens really until 45 seconds or so into the movie, it definitely was a bit of a surprise to me. But
yeah, welcome to the opening minutes of a movie in the movies by minutes style, my friend.
Yeah, we're gonna see a whole bunch of details that just go right over your head.
Yeah.
But so the first thing we do see is that on-screen text that says, forgive my pronunciation, I hope I'm getting this right, Puente Antiguo, New Mexico.
Right.
Which I believe you looked up, and that word translates as Old Bridge, correct?
Yeah, Puente Antiguo is Old Bridge, and it was an interesting decision that they had on their part of actually naming this small town that we're going to be spending a lot of time in this film, Puente Antiguo, because they wanted an idea of this little town being a reflection of Asgard, and Old Bridge kind of tying into the whole idea of the Rainbow Bridge and the Bifrost and that whole thing. We're going to be talking about I have a feeling the connections between kind of like this town and those elements and Asgard a lot over the course of this movie.
Listeners who haven't heard me on my other podcast should know I have a great habit of taking some tiny detail and thinking of all the things that makes me think, and then assuming the filmmaker must have had all those things intentional. So everything I'm about to say might be completely running with it, but I think bridges have so much meaning in this movie. I mean, because this you're right, it's the Rainbow Bridge, which is such an important part of Asgard. Also, this town is now going to be the beginning of rebuilding the bridge between Midgard and Asgard, in terms of like, here's where the connection begins again. And in a few moments, we'll get to talking about the last time Midgard and Asgard were in contact with each other. But also, and this we're going to get into a lot more as we go further, Kenneth Branagh, the director, obviously had so much thought about the human relationships in this movie that often were not the people relationships, I should say, that often were, that there were gaps. And I think at one point he mentions in the commentary, like an offhand comment about like, this is about like Loki and Thor, like, could there be a bridge in their relationship? The relationships with Odin, could there be a bridge there? And there isn't. Maybe I'm just reading a whole bunch into it, but I wonder if that's one other part of this idea of so much of this movie is about the bridges that aren't there, the relationships that they can't quite fix in the movie, and that this town's also where that's going to happen.
I think that's really a great way to look at it. And I certainly think that, in the way that, filmmakers often talk about these sorts of things, I mean, they could have had, many conversations and very long conversations about exactly the point you're just making about the idea of a bridge being a connection between two things and the way that these connections can be strengthened or destroyed. And I think that we're going to be seeing a lot of that over the course of this film.
Now, you also, I know, have looked into this, and that the fact that it's in New Mexico is very specific, especially in tying into the comic books. Talk to us a bit about that.
It's funny, New Mexico doesn't figure into the comics so much, but J. Michael Straczynski, who wrote the comic line for Thor, he took it on in... Quick shout out, also the author and director and showrunner for Babylon 5, one of the most unknown but fantastic Star Trek style sci-fi shows out there. Sorry, go on. Yeah. JMS needs the shout out. Absolutely. So I'm sure we'll be shouting a lot out to JMS over the course of this, who actually also had a hand in writing the script, or I should say really kind of developed the story for this with Mark Protasevich before the three screenwriters came on to actually write the screenplay. But JMS started the Thor line that he worked on in, I believe, 2008. And that Thor line, I think that it became prominent because of the fact that Thor still had the human persona of Donald Blake, but it had kind of been stripped from him, and it actually starts with him kind of bringing that persona back and settling in, of all places, rural Oklahoma, and going to the town and all this sort of stuff. And he's trying to like let Thor out again because, it's post Ragnarok, and I should say post a Ragnarok. There are a lot of Ragnaroks that happen over the course of the comic lines, but he ends up building a new Asgard, basically over Oklahoma, and starts bringing all the Asgardians back to live there.
Oh, interesting.
But it's a really, I haven't read all of it, but I really enjoy kind of that thread of Thor working to rebuild a new Asgard here in Midgard, which I think speaks to kind of that whole idea that we'll eventually talk about with Odin's comments about Asgard being a people, not a place, by the time we get to Thor Ragnarok, the film. Right. But certainly the look that JMS really kind of created with that, of this god living in a very rural, flat, deserty sort of landscape, I think that spoke to the writers as they were coming up with where they were going to place this particular story, and decided New Mexico would probably be a great place to take it. My hunch is why it's in New Mexico is because of the tax incentives, which is, why so many things get filmed in New Mexico these days. I mean, I'm sure they could have written it as Oklahoma still, but
right.
But I think New Mexico is fine. And I know Branagh really appreciated still having the great big open skies, which was a very big thing that he wanted to make sure that he had an element of as they made this film.
And we'll get to that in a second. I think the only other thing that to me comes up about New Mexico is much later in the movie, we get the scene where there's the standoff against the destroyer, the huge kind of like sentient robot thing that Loki sends. And it feels very much to me like an Old West showdown. And so I do wonder if that was also part of the thing. And Oklahoma is Old West, but I think New Mexico and Tombstone and all really evokes that. But you're right. But I think, to me, one of the most interesting things about this level of analysis is where you look at, like, what do they do for story reasons and what do they do for practical reasons?
Yeah,
And I think I think it's probably a little of both. It's New Mexico is Old West, and it's also cheaper. Back when Disney cared about those things, because I think today they set it wherever the heck they want. But I love that you mentioned it, because we do then get, that's the next shot we get, is we start with this big starry sky and then kind of go down to this one little van on Earth. And I thought, to me, one of the most interesting things is that it starts with a literal light in the darkness. At first, all we really see is this very, very dark sky. And at first, it's kind of the light of the van, and it's very dark, and you can't really make it out. What'd you kind of get out of that shot of, like, starting with the big sky and then moving down to just these three specific people in the van, as we then learn?
Well, I think that especially the way the Branagh framed that, right? I mean, we have this, and it's very dark. It's like a moonless night, but it's a very, big sky that we see here. And we get this very gentle tilt down to this van in the distance. It's not like right in front of us. I mean, it's a little bit away, and it's almost like stars itself, right? It has its headlights on and some of its kind of like side lights, which makes us think, oh, this is some sort of a science vehicle because it has lights that aren't just on the front and back. But it's so small, and I think it puts in perspective this idea that while there is an earthbound story that we're kind of settling into here in this Puente Antiguo, at the same time, these people, can be seen as just, a gnat in this big universe, which, you often hear kind of this description of who we are in our place of this universe. So
it reminds me of those memes you sometimes see of a picture of, like, all the stars in the sky and this one this arrow pointing to one little dot in the midst of it saying, "You are here."
Exactly.
It's
right.
kind of like showing that. And I want to share a quote from Kenneth Branagh, because I think we're going to be talking a lot about his thought, because, he was the director clearly, but it's also very clear he wasn't just they bring him in 2 months before shooting to get an idea of this. He was a key part of the production of this movie from day one. And he wrote, "It was an absolute gut certainty for me coming into the sort of process of pitching for the job, really, because he really, he pushed for this. He wanted this.
Right.
That we had to be on contemporary Earth, and we had to start there. We had to let the audience know that people looked and sounded like us, and crucially, had perhaps some of the sarcasm and cynicism, and in some cases, sort of scientific rigor to just check out the facts." What's your kind of take on that perspective of Branagh's and how it fits into with the movie we're about to talk about?
For somebody who's coming to this project, who has done a lot of Shakespeare and who certainly has a perspective of things, of like these stories of great grandeur, I think that he can see that, Asgard is pretty big. It's this royal family essentially that we're following. And it's like, we need to find a way to start with, finding that human connection and how we can step into this story. And I think that's what I really liked about the way that he approached this, is saying, let's look at the human side of all of this, and because even with the Asgardians, we're still looking at the human side of brothers and families and parents and all that sort of thing. And I think that's the angle that he approached it with. And I'm glad that he came at it from that perspective.
I think it's a very conscious choice he makes to make the movie much more accessible. And frankly, I think it's a big part of why the movie works for me. I don't have your kind of academic training background in cinema and things like that, so I may be butchering these terms here. But I know that, the point of view character of a movie is very important, and it shifts somewhat through the movie. But I feel like if the movie had started with a point of view character of someone on Asgard, it would be very hard for me to get into it, because I love this movie and I love the Asgard scenes. If you're not careful, they can seem a little hokey almost, or a little just sort of like, it just feels so kind of separate from our own world that you don't really know what's going on. But when the point of view, I think the point of view character is Darcy more than anything else. And we will get into really in the next couple of minutes with her cynicism and the kind of like, well, sure, I want to figure out science, but I also don't want to, get thrown on it. I'm just getting college credits.
I don't want to die, right?
Yeah, exactly. And because that's what he says about the sarcasm and the cynicism. If it's just a god shows up and all the people are like, ooh, Thor, look at his pretty hair, look at his powers, you lose me. But having it be about these people who, I think we talked about this a bit in the primers, and we'll talk about it more, but this movie is such a huge shift, Iron Man is just a guy with technology, and I can believe that would be possible. The physics are, yeah, but the Hulk is a guy with some technology, the Captain America, etc. Captain America is a later movie, but this movie is like, you're now asking me to believe in a whole bunch of stuff that's way beyond my normal, idea of what's possible or not. And so for the movie to be about people who are just as cynical as I am, slowly coming to believe it, I just think was such a brilliant way to frame it.
I think that it becomes something that people at Marvel certainly will recognize. Because, and I know I'm jumping way far into the future, but think about what James Gunn did with Guardians of the Galaxy. It's the exact same idea, right? The approach that we need to start grounded with Earth, with somebody that we can connect with before we jump into this crazy story about all this stuff going on at the far ends of the galaxy. And I just think that it's a very smart way to approach this type of story. And so for me, the fact that, I walk into the movie theater, the lights go down, and all of a sudden I'm in New Mexico, it's like, okay, that's interesting. That's interesting to me. And here I am in a van of some sort of science stuff going on. It's very interesting.
I was going to say that, at least because that's something I can relate to, but the honesty is I'm liberal arts 100%. Being in a van doing science is completely, that's as far into my world as Asgard, but at least New Mexico I can understand.
Right. But at the same time, you can look at that and go, oh, okay, science. I get a sense of that there being a grounding here, right? Because I think if anything, the idea of science is a very grounded element. I'm going to study what is around me in a very kind of intentional way, where I'm looking at what's there and what's not, without kind of getting all poetic about it or seeing kind of the magical sides of things.
And one thing I think is also really interesting is we literally don't have a single word of dialogue in this first minute, and that seems mind-blowing to me, but I'm sure actually it happens all the time in movies. The only thing that really speaks is the music, and it's orchestral music. It's Patrick Doyle's track, Chasing the Storm. An interesting note kind of here, Patrick Doyle has actually been working with Kenneth Branagh since all the way back to my personal favorite Branagh movie, Henry V in 1989. St. Crispin's Day speech, still one of the most moving moments I've ever seen in cinema. And this is actually his 9th collaboration with Branagh. And I think there's a real magic. It kind of reminds me of, oh God, they're going to throw me out of being a goth from high school because now I can't remember. Danny Elfman, Tim Burton and Danny Elfman. They're just like, you can't imagine one without the other in some ways, especially Burton without Elfman. And I think it's awesome seeing that, I think that same level of dynamic really seems to have happened here with Branagh and Doyle, where they just know Doyle seems to know what Branagh wants and can give it. I think that collaboration, adds so much to this movie.
I think there has been some grief given to the Marvel films for the lack of really strong orchestral themes, which, as a fan of film score, I certainly can agree with. I listen to, I enjoy Ramin Djawadi. I enjoy what he did with Iron Man. I do think that he came up with at least a strong kind of, electric guitar kind of, short theme for who Iron Man is that is easy to play and reference. Oh, that's Iron Man. Incredible Hulk, I think there were some interesting elements in that film too, and Iron Man 2. But by the time we get to Patrick Doyle, I hear that name and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm going to get some strong orchestral pieces in this that give me a sense of this character and everything. And that certainly is something that we will find over the course of this film, that there are some great kind of big themes that make me feel like I have a sense of Asgard and of Thor.
Especially because for me, I think that critique of Marvel is fairly legit. But I think when you're just starting out, establishing the MCU, establishing some new things, having the orchestral music being powerful in part because you don't always notice it, I don't think is a terrible choice. I think once we get to the 10th or 15th Marvel movie and they're still doing those kind of things, then I'm like, let's maybe branch out a bit. Let's maybe Captain Marvel is very noticeable to me, and that is like lyrical music. Same with Guardians of the Galaxy for that reason. But that's I'm going to be top tangent king here. We're going to go off on a lot of tangents, but I'll try to kind of will our say back. Besides the music, we also hear a lot of background noise in the scene. What are the things that kind of jumped out at you about the other the parts of New Mexico that are speaking when we don't have any actual dialogue?
Well, yeah, I mean, once we kind of really settle in on this location, it really is kind of night noises, right? We hear crickets. It sounds like there might be some sort of a cicada or something else that's kind of doing its little noise. There's a few other things that kind of do soft, gentle chirps. But really, like as we tilt down to the van and we settle on the van, we can, if we listen really carefully, you can hear kind of the engine is running. So we know it's not just sitting out here in the dark off. It's actually kind of running for some particular reason, perhaps because of equipment. I don't know. And then we also start hearing like there's a little, I don't know, some sort of a computer noise that we hear that once we hear that, we kind of cut into the van. But yeah, it's very much kind of like night noises.
I think it just kind of helps to settle again. Like these people are studying the stars. And I grew up in New York City. There's not a lot of astronomy to be done in New York City because there's just way too much light. And you think about it, like if they're going to go study something way out in the stars, not just look at Mars, this is where they go. They go to the place where all it is night noise because there's no people around. There's no cars around. I think just little details like that.
Well, and it's funny that they identify this as Puente Antiguo because we're clearly not in the town. Like we might be near the town, but we're like out in the middle of nowhere, right? I mean, it is like legit like desert, and that's all we're in at this particular location.
Yeah, maybe it's the name of the county.
Yeah, right.
Like that, the town seat. Now, something else I know that Branagh pointed out in the commentary track, which, by the way, if you get a hold on, is very well worth listening to. We're going to reference it a lot. I think really gives some great insight. But he talks about Dutch angles and shooting this with Dutch angles because it really reminds him of the comic books that he read. And we'll get into the fact that Branagh's a comic book fan. That blew my mind. But I'll be honest, I listened to that, and the first thing I had to do was go Google, Wikipedia Dutch angles. I'm not a film person. You are. What's a Dutch angle? What does that mean in terms of what we're seeing on film and what Branagh was trying to do?
A Dutch angle is really like when you frame the shot. I mean, normally if you position a camera, you're going to kind of balance the frame of it so that the frame is exactly kind of parallel to the ground that you're looking at. So when you see the frame, the ground looks basically as flat as perhaps the edge of the frame. And when you do a Dutch angle, you're actually purposefully tilting the camera one way or the other so that everything is off kilter. And so if you look in the background of any particular shot of the characters, wherever you see a line that should be a horizontal line, like parallel to the flat surface of the ground, it will be at a big angle, kind of tilted up off to one side or the other. And so that's kind of what a Dutch angle is. And it's definitely something that, it has its popularity here and there in the world of filmmaking in general. But it's not often as used as much as Branagh certainly uses it in this film. And I mean, right out of the gate, we start seeing it when we jump into the van here.
I'm glad we had that explanation because there's some scenes later on in the movie where they're coming to rescue Thor that definitely use that to an extreme example. And I noted like the angles here, what they mean. I hadn't connected that to the Dutch angle thing. So that's definitely going to be a great thing to look at.
Yeah, right.
Now, obviously, this movie is pretty much kind of set on its own, but we know that this movie doesn't just happen in a vacuum. And when Iron Man happens, the end is Nick Fury coming to tell him about the Avengers Initiative. But it doesn't actually set up Hulk in any way. And then Hulk doesn't really kind of set up Iron Man 2 in any way. But then at the end of Iron Man 2, we literally get like that shot in the end credits of the hammer has landed on Earth. We know that Thor is coming.
Right.
So this is kind of a fun movie. And this is the first one where it's really directly tied into, because I think when they made this movie, it was the first time they really knew like Iron Man and Hulk were successes. We can do this big project we have. what else is happening in the MCU at the time this happens? Because the timing of this, I think, is pretty important.
Oh, absolutely. And, I mean, and to your point, I think part of the reason for all of that is because, The Incredible Hulk was tied into Universal, not Paramount. And so they couldn't put those direct things. So this literally is the second film that has happened after one that immediately preceded it that came from the same place. And so to that end, they were able to create that lead in, as you discussed, like kind of that hammer falling. And then, of course, because, they love going back and retrofitting all of this to be happening at the same time because somebody needed to build a schedule for all of this and when it all happened. And all of this, they decided, what we're seeing here is happening in late May 2010. And all of what we're seeing in Iron Man 2 and The Incredible Hulk, which you've already heard Kyle and Rob on the last 2 seasons talking about how this is all happening at the same time. Now we're finally in Thor, and we're continuing this third story that's happening during the exact same window of time. What's immediately preceded this is May 29th, 2010, S.H.I.E.L.D. had began monitoring Bruce Banner, Jane Foster, and Tony Stark. And this is Tony Stark's birthday. He and Rhodey nearly blew his house up. The next day, May 30th, 2010, Jane, who had been seeing things in the New Mexico desert, she contacts Erik Selvig about the disturbances, and he flies out to New Mexico to help her. It so happens that her message is intercepted by S.H.I.E.L.D. Meanwhile, in Asgard, this is also Thor's coronation and then subsequently his attack on Jotunheim. We're going to see more of that, and we don't necessarily know what all is happening with that because we're currently on May 31st, 2010, and right now we're with Jane, Erik, and Darcy. They're going out to the deserts to monitor these disturbances. Obviously, as we'll find out, it's the same day Thor gets cast out of Asgard. And interestingly, as far as Bruce Banner is concerned, this is when he arrives at Culver University looking for Betty. Meanwhile, over in New York, the battle at the Stark Expo is happening. And as we have talked about on our hiatus episode, this is also the day that there is a robbery that takes place at the Roxxon gas station in New Mexico, which Coulson prevents. Busy time.
And I love all that, and especially I'm going to try not doing this too much, but now that like the Babylon 5 door has been opened, I need to kind of step through it every now and then because I know we want to make these connections. I know that JMS is not responsible for this level of deep continuity, as we would say over on the Marvel Cinematic Universe podcast, the part of the podcast network I'm part of. But clearly his fingerprints, I think, are involved in this. And I bring that up because for those who haven't seen it, Babylon 5 it was really one of the first TV shows at a time when everything was still very episodic, where when JMS sat down to start writing episode 1, he knew exactly where the last episode of season 5 was going to end. And it didn't all work out perfectly, but it was really a kind of revolutionary thing in terms of like having all these connections made from episode to episode, season to season, of all the ways the pieces were going to fit together. And so I don't know if he helped inspire that or if he just loved it because of his background in it. But knowing that JMS was part of what I think of as one of the other great examples of, even though sometimes it doesn't all fit together, or they say, oh, it's time travel, it doesn't matter. Knowing that, like, he's connected to the MCU, which is also where they tried to have all these pieces fit together, especially in the ways you just talked about, of this one incredible 3-day period where so much happens. It just makes my Babylon 5 heart so happy, knowing those connections.
I love that. I love that it's another sort of like this epic storytelling style where you have an end game. See what I did there? You have an end game with what you're trying to do over the course of multiple stories. That's pretty cool.
Especially because, as we'll get into, I feel like one of the main characters of this is S.H.I.E.L.D. in some ways, and that this movie, we'll talk more about it later, this movie is where S.H.I.E.L.D. stops being kind of Coulson being the bumbling guy who Tony's making fun of, but S.H.I.E.L.D. really starts to have some power and even a little bit of menace. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that. We've gone on a bit. I kind of feel like once we have talked for 30 times longer than the period of time of the movie we're discussing, that maybe it's about time to start wrapping it up. But are there any other kind of last things that you wanted to get into about this that we haven't touched on yet?
The only other thing which we can certainly kind of continue in the conversation next time is, once we're in the van, we do get a little flash of the computer screen that Jane is working on, and it shows the Van Allen belts. This is the radiation belt. It's a zone of energetic charged particles around the Earth, most of which originate in the solar wind. named after James Van Allen, who discovered them. It's obviously something in relation to what she's studying. So we'll talk more about that as we jump into the next minute.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that because it's, as we'll talk about, Branagh really cared about the real science. He did want to, as much as possible, make this something that could fit into the science of our day. You know, I mean, obviously there's a lot of, there's a lot of leaps you got to make, but he wanted it to be rounded somewhat, and I love that. Other just little thing I wanted to mention, because it's just kind of a fun thing. We talked about how the Paramount logo is still featured in this. Paramount is not obviously a partner with Marvel for a long time, but I think, is that because at that point, Paramount was the ones who owned Marvel, and that's who Disney bought Marvel from?
No, they didn't own it, but they had a distribution deal that they had worked out with Marvel Entertainment to kind of distribute these films. And so they had, because I think Disney bought Marvel in 2009. So at this point, they were just still releasing it with Paramount. And it wouldn't be, I think, until a few more years, a few more films before the Paramount logo will end up disappearing. Because it's still, it's still on the Avengers. I think by the time we get into phase 2, that's when we'll start looking at some different logos in there.
Definitely. And just other cool things, Paramount is actually it's the oldest surviving Hollywood film logo.
Yeah.
In 2011, it gets changed for their 100th anniversary, but that hadn't happened yet. And it has 22 stars. Andy, do you know why it has 22 stars?
I've heard about this, about the fact that it relates to, I don't know if it's the number of stars that they had contracted at the time, I believe, but something like that. It was 22 stars for 22 stars that they were working with.
It's not enough for Thor trivia. We're going to give you science trivia. We're going to give you Paramount trivia. We're going to get into the trivia of wigs when we talk about Thor's wig. That is, people have some questions about that. But all that's going to come. So thank you so much for kind of tuning in. Really excited to do this. Really excited to have your support going all the way. And I just want to say have a good day.
Until next time, true believers.
Marvel Movie Minute is a production of True Story FM, engineering by Andy Nelson. This season's music is One Last Ride by Martin Puringer. Find the show at truestory.fm, and if your podcast app allows ratings and reviews, consider doing that for this show.